Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third annual Dr. Harold and Mrs. Laura Greer lecture. I'm Dr. Rocio Gomez, an assistant professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I'll be introducing tonight's speaker and moderating the Q&A after the presentation. Before we begin, just two quick announcements. First is that this event is being recorded and will be shared on VCU accounts. And second, you will have an opportunity to ask the speaker questions at the end of the presentation. You can submit your questions in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. So now on to our speaker. Johanna Londoño is an associate professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of Latin American, Caribbean, and U.S. Latino and Latina Studies at the University at Albany, State University of New York. She holds a PhD in American Studies from NYU and a BFA from the Cooper Union School of Art. Londoño has been a fellow with the Ford Foundation and the Princeton Mellon Initiative in Architecture, Urbanism, and the Humanities, among others. Published last year with Duke University Press, Dr. Londoño's first book, Abstract Barrios, The Crises of Latinx Visibility in U.S. Cities, received the 2020 Outstanding Book Award from the Latin American Studies Association Latinx Studies section. Tonight, she will be discussing her recent book. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Johanna Londoño.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rocio Gomez. Let me share my screen now. And hopefully you can see that okay. So good evening. Thank you again, Dr. Gomez and the Department of History at Virginia Commonwealth University for this lovely invitation. I'm so happy to be here with all of you to talk about my research, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. Before I start, I should note that this presentation is based on my recently published book, Abstract Barrios. In the book, I argue that the built environment is a crucial element for manipulating Latinx exclusion and inclusion in US cities. The book complicates the commonplace, scholarly, and everyday celebration of Latinx cultural expression in the built environment. In the early 2000s, when I was starting graduate school, much of the scholarship on Latinx majority places saw barrio landscapes as resistant to state disinvestment in neighborhoods of color, or as resistant to a capitalist development that sought to displace existing low-income neighborhoods to make room for higher rents and wealthier residents. Though I found this particular scholarship to be galvanizing and fascinating, I had a hunch that it wasn't telling the whole story. So instead of following in this vein, the book exposes multiple interests and contexts, as well as a diverse group of individuals, specifically developers, property owners, architects, urban planners. And I collectively refer to these individuals as brokers. Why? Because they have the power to shape the built environment in a way that is distant from the working class, messy, and unpredictable visual landscape that is so typical of barrios. So initially, the research was driven by a very simple question: who Latinizes cities? In other words, who is behind the Latinx cultural expression in built space, such as the one pictured here. This is a photograph of my hometown, Union City, New Jersey. And so I wanted to know who is behind the Latinx cultural expression in built space and why, right? Why are they Latinizing this particular built environment? And I sought to answer this question by using an interdisciplinary multi-methodological approach. The book is in conversation with the fields of urban history, Latinx studies, and urban design. It uses data collected from numerous archives, interviews, and visual analysis. My training as a design and art student in college, and then in an interdisciplinary American Studies doctoral program, encouraged me to find a wide array of sources and frameworks for understanding how and why Latinx spaces are produced. When I began my research, I initially started with the archives, interviewees, and case studies I knew that discussed Barrios space, such as the Latino Design Archives at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, prominent urban designers such as former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Henry Cisneros, and landscapes such as that in downtown Santa Ana, California, and my hometown, Union City, New Jersey. But ultimately, I consulted 12 archives, performed nearly 60 interviews with people based in San Antonio, Texas, Miami, New York City, and Los Angeles, and I focused on 3 places: Union City, the Lower East Side in New York City, and Santa Ana, California. Altogether, these sources allowed me to stitch together a story that spans almost 60 years from the 1950s to the 2010s. In doing the research, I found that the excitement over the built environment betrays a simultaneous preoccupation with Barrios. Specifically, the fear that Latinx people and the barrio spaces they create are transgressing normative expectations of urbanness, premised on white urban life and culture. I refer to this fear as an ongoing crisis of Latinx belonging in cities. These crises are actively negotiated over time by the individuals I feature in my writing. Though much of my talk today will focus on the book, I want to actually start with a different example. And that's because one of the points I make in the introduction is that my argument about Latinx built environments is not limited to the case studies presented in the book. So let me preface with this much more recent example found in the highly anticipated and controversially received musical film In the Heights. The film is based on the Broadway musical of the same name, written by Lin-Manuel Miranda, the creative behind the theatrical hit Hamilton. One of the key shooting locations for In the Heights was a bodega, City Mart Tropical Products, shown here in this slide. Bodegas like these have long been the epitome of Latinx entrepreneurship in cities, especially northeastern cities, and even more so among Dominican New Yorkers, one of the main populations in Washington Heights, the uptown New York City neighborhood where the film is set. In the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, Dominican immigrants bought stores from Puerto Rican owners. By the 90s, Dominicans were the majority among Latinx bodegueros, leading ethnographer Milagros Ricord to call the bodega, quote, the quintessential Dominican business, end quote. Indeed, bodegas have become icons of New York City working class ethnic communities and Dominican New York identity. Showtime comedians Desus of Jamaican descent and Mero of Dominican descent, both from the Bronx, named their acclaimed podcast Bodega Brothers. Emerging Dominican New York artist Lucia Hierro drew inspiration from the bodega she grew up with to make her Mercado series of large-scale sculptures of grocery bags full of items that may be bought in a bodega. And after a visit to Washington Heights, recent New York City mayoral candidate Andrew Yang tweeted a photo of himself in what he described as a bodega. The tweet was immediately controversial, as observants ridiculed Yang and pointed out that the store did not look like a bodega because it was too spacious and too neat. In thinking about all of these 3 examples, it is clear that bodegas are seen as indicators of New York City authenticity and grit. But despite this ongoing association of Dominicans and bodegas, since the early 2000s, Dominican ownership of bodegas has declined. Moreover, the stores have been the target of redevelopment and gentrification. The so-called death of the bodega was announced by the New York Times in 2015, and then in 2018 in 6 Feet Square, a real estate online magazine, and in 2019 in Curbed New York, an online magazine. Bodegas have been increasingly replaced with chain pharmacies like Duane Reade and Rite Aid. And their ability to cater to low-income consumers has been compromised by draconian regulations to the food stamp program. Moreover, New York City's ever-expanding gentrification has led to commercial rent hikes that displace mom and pop shops, including these bodegas. The new customers that gentrification brings with it have also sparked demand for more costly products that bodegueros, right, bodega owners, are ill-equipped to stock. So as you can see in these news articles that I've compiled here, city programs have stepped in to help transition bodegueros to this new gentrified reality, a move criticized as further aiding and abetting gentrification's racial and class shifts, rather than helping those at risk of displacement. Such programs encourage, if not pressure, bodegueros to replace their hand-painted signage and plentiful storefront ads for computer-generated awnings and signage and sparse windows. Now, Santo Domingo Grocery, the bodega that inspired In the Heights, seen over here on my left, seems to have fallen under this logic of standardizing facades to avert displacement. Though the film's writers intended for the film to be set in the contemporary moment and not in the early 2000s like the original Broadway play of In the Heights, they curiously opted to revert to a pre-gentrified landscape. As you can see on the slide, the awning and facade have been altered for the film. So this is the actual grocery that is seen in the film In the Heights. While Santo Domingo Grocery has a dark green awning, In the Heights, the bodega's awning is yellow. Nelson Coates, the film's white production designer, explained that he was going for a more, quote, old school New York bodega look. In addition to changing the color of the awning, he also made it larger by incorporating parts of nearby commercial real estate. And in addition to that, he added a mural, which you can see here on the right side. And murals, by the way, are one of the most praised, if not romanticized, elements of Latinx urban landscapes. So the film's desire to recreate and even reimagine the barrio landscape of Washington Heights amidst the neighborhood's precarious standing is reminiscent of another high-profile representation of barrio culture and life that I examine in the book, and that's West Side Story. The 1961 film West Side Story was shot in San Juan Hill, a neighborhood on the Upper West Side of Manhattan that was home to a Black community with a significant Puerto Rican and Cuban population. However, by the time the film began shooting, the streets were marked for demolition to build Lincoln Towers apartments, which is part of the larger Lincoln Square urban renewal area. Opening shots of the film's warring Puerto Rican and white gangs frenetically dancing on the street show signs of impending destruction. Here you see buildings with boarded up windows in the background and scaffold fencing. Production stills such as these show rubble left out of the film camera's frame, which you can see over here behind this car. Attempting to cover up the ruins of urban renewal, the film created a sanitized version of the urban life that once existed. White curtains, which you can see here behind one of the gangs, were hung on windows of empty buildings, and Se Habla Español and bodega signs, which you can see here and over here, were displayed to indicate local Latinx customers. There are other parallels between the two films, In the Heights and West Side Story. Both films are largely white-approved expressions of barrio culture and people. Their most rigorous critiques have come from Latinx viewers who don't see themselves fairly represented on screen. Also, the two films use bright color, most notably on the facade of bodegas, right, such as this yellow bodega sign right here, though elsewhere too. Right? And they use this bright color to romantically gesture towards authentic barrio culture at risk of displacement. So though the two examples I've provided thus far in the Heights and West Side Story are media representations, their use of bright color to appeal to both non-Latinx white and Latinx people in order to distract from ethno-racial tensions in the city has